Chapter 4. The Liberation of Northern Caucasia. We sailed on the King Albert. It was crowded. Since the volunteers had been occupying the port of Novorossiysk and the town of Ekaterinodar, the people who had fled from the Red Terror had gone back home. There were a large number of Germans amongst the passengers. I made friends with a German professor, an inspector of the military hospitals used by the Army of Occupation. The German command did not officially prohibit officers from joining the volunteer army, but in actual practice they put all kinds of difficulties in the way. At Kerch, our passports were examined. As I was with the German professor, they did not even glance at our papers. Rostov was full of people and humming with life. The town had become a temporary capital for southern Russia, as Kiev had for the Ukraine. The streets were full of life, and nothing had changed. Even the policemen at the railway station still wore their old uniforms. Some German uniforms in the streets were the only things that reminded one of the real situation. At Ekaterinodar, we could feel that we were in the rear of an army. There were nothing but uniforms on all sides. I found several acquaintances easily enough, but only with the greatest difficulty did I find a lodging. I knew neither the Chief of Staff at Supreme Headquarters nor the Quartermaster General, but I recognized one or two old comrades amongst the officers. They told me that Kornilov had tried to find me and had written to me twice from Petersburg. Neither of his letters had reached me. When I arrived, the volunteer army did not exceed 35,000 men and 80 guns. The infantry, artillery, and engineers were almost entirely composed of officers. The cavalry, with the exception of 2 regiments which were attached to infantry units, of Kuban Cossacks and Circassians. Most of the officers were unknown to me. The only arms and ammunition the army had were those it had captured from the enemy. The re-equipping was done at the expense of the people. Our enemy numbered 80,000 and had 100 guns. They had the reserve stores of the old army at then disposal, and arms and munitions to spare, but on the other hand they were badly organized, badly led, and ill-disciplined. The next day, I went to present myself to Generals Alexiev and Denikin. The former was seriously ill and could not see me. I only knew General Denikin through having met him several times in Manchuria during the Japanese War and at Supreme Headquarters. He received me in the presence of General Romanovsky, his Chief of Staff. General Denikin was a man of average height and powerful build, with a grizzled beard and mustache. He gave me the impression of being thoughtful, resolute, well-balanced, and a thoroughgoing Russian. He was known to be courageous and honest, and very well versed in military science. During the ill-fated existence of the provisional government, he had been Chief of Staff to Supreme Headquarters, and had since then commanded the armies in the southwest. He had never been afraid to speak his mind freely and to defend the honor of the army and of the officers' companies in public. He reminded me of our meeting in Manchuria and told me that Kornilov had spoken of me many times. "Well, General," he said, "what are we going to do? I really do not know what you propose. Our effective force is not very large." "As your Excellency knows," I replied, "in 1917 I was commanding a cavalry troop, but back in 1914 I commanded a squadron. I am not yet too old to do so again." "That nonsense," he said. "A squadron, if you would be content with a brigade." "Certainly, Your Excellency." "That's splendid. The general," indicating Romanovsky, "will tell you all you want to know about the situation." The next day, I called on Romanovsky. He seemed to be intelligent and well-informed, but the favorable impression which he had made on me at first was somewhat modified, for he had a way of never looking straight at anyone and would always avoid your eyes. He gave me my appointment, not as brigadier general, as I was expecting, but as lieutenant general. The next day, I went to find my division, which was operating in the Maikop district. The byroads along which we drove were good, the going excellent. As far as the eye could see, stretched fields stacked with great wheat sheaves, orchards and kitchen gardens overflowing with golden melons. The large villages, the white houses with their red-tiled roofs, the churches with their gilded domes, and the steam mills all bore witness to the wealth and fertility of the countryside. The old fellow who was guiding us told us of the horrors perpetrated by the Reds. He said that the people blessed the day when the volunteer army had come to help them get rid of their oppressors. In a village, I ran into a platoon of Cossacks. They turned out to be the escort of the lieutenant general I was to succeed. He told me that the division was in the thick of an attack. We hastily swallowed a mouthful of food and then got into the saddle again and went to join the troops. I discovered several old comrades in arms amongst the officers and soldiers. In the evening, we went along to my headquarters, and I spent the night working with my chief of staff. Technical equipment was almost entirely lacking. We had nothing but a wireless apparatus, no telegraph, and no telephone. We re-equipped ourselves with munitions at the enemy's expense, though occasionally the general staff sent us cartridges and shells from the Don. For our medical service, we had a surgeon and 2 sisters of charity, but there was no linen for dressing wounds and no drugs. The casualties were enormous, and the gaps were filled by volunteers who had to go straight into battle without any preliminary training. Each individual soldier fought well, but as a corporate entity, the army left much to be desired. My whole division numbered only 2,500 men and 3 field batteries. As the land was won back, the village assemblies met and elected communal councils, which took over the commissariat and means of transport. They also dispensed justice and handed over Bolshevists to the authorities. This gave rise to many abuses. Too often, the people used their authority to square private accounts and take vengeance on their enemies. But we had to restore a certain amount of order somehow. To make matters worse, we were short of staff and time. Yet, although this semblance of order was very imperfect, it was better than anarchy. The Bolshevists had 12 to 15,000 infantry, 25 or 30 guns, and several hundred horsemen, and were well provided with ammunition and technical equipment. The Red soldiers themselves fought well, but their commanders were hopelessly inadequate. To our right, in the Maikop district, General Pokrovsky's cavalry division was operating, but our communications were imperfect. To our left, along the line of the Caucasia Armavir Railway, Colonel Drostovsky's infantry division was in constant communication with us. Our division was to drive back the enemy, who were occupying Urop on the other side of the river. The enemy's position, which we had to take, was near the village of Mikhailovskaya, protected by the deep river Laba, on the left bank of which the enemy held a bridgehead, a range of hills and swamps. As, in addition, they had far more artillery than we and were abundantly supplied with ammunition, which we lacked altogether, all our efforts to advance were in vain. I made up my mind to alter things. A brigade defeated the enemy and succeeded in advancing through Mikhailovskaya and occupying the line of the Armavir-Tuapse railway. But this did not lead to anything. The Reds wheeled round, and by using a large number of trains and armored motor lorries, forced the brigade to retreat. For 3 weeks, we tried in vain to drive off the enemy. During this time, Supreme Headquarters bombarded me with dispatches demanding energetic action and an attack at all costs. But in spite of my urgent entreaties, they did not send me supplies of ammunition. During September, there were some unimportant engagements. Sometimes the enemy harassed us, sometimes we fell upon them. Our total losses were large. In August and September, my division lost 260 officers and 2,460 men, that is to say, 100% of its effective force. The gaps were filled immediately with recruits from the recently freed territory. In the middle of the night of October 1st, I was told that the enemy had blown up the railway bridge and were concentrating their forces on the right bank of the Laba. I gave the order for an offensive. From that day on, operations took place in the open country and were of the kind in which maneuvering is more important than numerical strength. We won victory after victory. We advanced in double column. On October 2nd, I entered Mikhailovskaya, where an enormous crowd had assembled to receive me. The ancients, as the Caucasians call the most respected men of their country, offered me bread and salt, according to custom. Many of them wept as they told me of all they had had to suffer from the Reds. The Bolshevists had taken away with them as hostages the richest men in the district, also the family of the inspector of the local school and a priest. Several ancients had been shot on the eve of the departure of the Reds. October 1st was the date of the village church festival. I went to Mass, and it was more than ordinarily moving. Everyone prayed with unusual fervor and affecting sincerity. When I came out of church, I found a brigade of Cossacks and Circassians in the market square. On their left flank, under the green Mahometan flag, was a detachment of Circassian ancients who had come down from the mountains to join us. The Awuls I had suffered cruelly at the hands of the Bolshevists. Several had been burnt out, and many Circassians had been tortured and shot. In one of the Awuls, half a score of men had been buried alive. The ancients told me that they were putting their sons under my command. Though they themselves wished to return to their villages, they promised, however, that they would come at the first appeal and fight side by side with their sons. I thanked them, and at their earnest request, handed over to them a couple of dozen prisoners, that they might bring them to justice on the spot where their crimes had been committed. But I had scarcely set off with my troops before the Circassians threw themselves upon the prisoners and cut them to pieces before the eyes of the villagers. In a neighboring village, I came upon the Cossacks of Pokrovsky's division robbing the villagers. To my indignation, I perceived several Cossack officers amongst the marauders. I sent for them and told them that if I found them still within the boundaries of my division, in half an hour's time they would be shot. In half an hour, there was not a single Cossack in the village. I reported their conduct to General Pokrovsky. Unfortunately, I suspected, and my suspicions were soon justified, that the general not only took no measures against the marauders, but even tacitly encouraged them. The Cossacks had themselves been robbed of everything they possessed, so that it was difficult, indeed impossible, to rid them of their desire to get back an equivalent wherever they could find it. Considerable sums of money were to be found on almost every enemy. The baggage was packed full of all manner of things, from sugar and tobacco to furs, rugs, cut glass, furniture, and pianos. At the beginning of the Civil War, before the Bolsheviks had begun raising recruits, their army had been composed solely of escaped convicts, out-and-out riffraff, and the scum of the old army. They had robbed and massacred the populace, killed off the wounded, and raped the women. When our units saw this, they could not be made to behave decently. Since they had no base and were completely surrounded by the enemy, they could not take any prisoners either. Destitute of everything, they re-equipped themselves at the expense of the countryside, showing not the slightest respect for other people's property. And it was impossible, at any rate at the beginning of the Civil War, to prevent such outrages. I contented myself with demanding that the booty seized from the enemy should be divided equally between all the soldiers, and I appointed supervisory committees. Afterwards, when, thanks to the help of the Allies, the army could obtain its supplies in a normal manner, I arranged that all the spoils of war should be handed over to the commissariat. But from the first, I had been ruthlessly opposed to all marauding and had caused offenders to be arrested. General Pokrovsky, and unfortunately he was not the only one, either could not or would not follow my example, and consequently I had to give up the idea of prohibiting this lawlessness. Everything was considered permissible. The result of this state of affairs was disastrous. The enemy put their infantry into wagons and retreated all along the line, covering 40 to 55 kilometers a day. One of our columns attacked them fiercely and captured their baggage, a number of machine guns, and some ammunition. I slept in the village of Konstantinovka. The master of the house, a fine old man with a long white beard, threw himself at my feet and wept. He was a very rich man and was held in great respect throughout the district. 3 of his sons had fled from the Reds, 2 had been shot, and his eldest son had been hiding in a cave with several friends for 4 months. He took me to see them. The sight of the poor devils made me shudder. The old man himself had had to be hidden in the straw for days to save his life. He discovered that one of his fugitive sons had been in my escort, another in one of my regiments. It is impossible to describe the father's joy. In the morning, the troops continued the pursuit. I remained behind for an hour or two, as I had orders to give, then I got into a car and went to rejoin one of my columns. I found the men having a meal. I learnt that the other column was fighting with the Red rearguard 6 kilometers farther on. I got into my car again and went to join it. The officer in charge of the column, Colonel Toporkov, and his general staff were on a hillock behind which a battery was posted. A couple of 100 paces away, 2 Cossack squadrons were covering it. The enemy were in a hollow about 1,500 paces away. Their shells almost reached us. I got out of the car and went over to the battery with 2 of my orderlies. I had scarcely reached it when I heard a cry of "the cavalry!" and saw my Cossacks gallop up furiously, hotly pursued by a great mob of enemy cavalry. The battery commander ordered an enfilade, but it did not stop the Reds. The Cossacks who were covering the artillery had come up already, the enemy at their heels. We attempted to stop them in vain. The whirlwind of horsemen swooped down upon us. The enemy fell upon the battery. One of the guns was done for. I saw an artillery officer fire point blank at a Red, but another of them struck him down with one blow of his sword. Colonel Toporkov, surrounded by foes, was slashing to right and left. I ran to my car, but it had been wrecked. The chauffeur and his assistants were a long way off. I hurried into a maize field. On both sides of me, Cossacks were dashing by. The gunners, too, were in flight. Shooting and slashing was still going on near the battery. An officer offered me his horse, but I refused it. As he insisted, I directed him to go to the village and bring back my escort and my horses, which he would find there. He set off at the gallop. I kept on running. Looking behind me, I saw 3 Reds galloping up. One of them caught up with one of our foot soldiers and attempted to cut him down, but the soldier fell upon his horse at close quarters, and the 2 other Reds fell upon him. I wanted to rush to his aid, but I was unarmed. I had no sword, and had given my revolver to an officer who was without one. At this moment, an ambulance car passed me at full speed. I ran after it as fast as I could, and managing to catch up with it, leapt on board. I was beside myself. The loss of the battery, the flight of the Cossacks, the failure of my efforts to stop them, all contributed to overwhelm me. My men no longer existed. We passed a soldier riding one horse and leading another. I took it, mounted, and hurried on to meet the Cossacks I had sent for. A brigade appeared at the trot. I ordered it to deploy, and we went in search of the enemy, but the Reds had already fallen back, taking with them 2 guns, my car, and some clothes which they had stripped from the bodies of our dead. They followed the line of their general retreat, crossed the river Orup, and entrenched themselves on the right bank. Pokrovsky's division was maneuvering on our right, and on its right flank was Colonel Chkuro and his Cossacks. To our left, between the Orup and the Kuban, General Kasanovich's division was to try and force the river Orup and throw the enemy back onto the farther bank of the Kuban. For 2 weeks, all our efforts were in vain. On October 19th, the enemy crossed the Orup and launched an offensive against the junction of my division and General Kasanovich's. The engagement was a brisk one and lasted for 12 hours. There were heavy losses on both sides. At last, towards night, we perceived that the enemy were beginning to retreat and had crossed the river again. I decided to wheel and attack them from the rear. 4 regiments crossed the Orup, and the movement succeeded. We took 3,000 prisoners and a large number of machine guns. As a final result, the enemy evacuated the whole of the left bank of the river Kuban. On October 22nd, I reached the village of Uspenskaya, where fighting was still in progress. At the sight of my pennon, loud hurrahs rang out from the Cossack ranks. Consciousness of victory and the intoxication of success gives spontaneous birth to confidence in the commander and creates that bond which is the strength of armies. From that moment on, I held my units, and our division knew no more defeats. One section of the enemy was in flight along the railway track towards Stavropol, the other towards Armavir. One of my brigades had started off in pursuit, the other went to reinforce the neighboring division. I remained in the village of Uspenskaya with 2 regiments. In that night's work, we had taken considerable amount of booty from the enemy, besides many prisoners, and it all had to be cleared up. My division, on its formation, had been reinforced by the cadres of a Cossack infantry division. There was nothing left of it but a score or 2 of men. All the rest had been killed. For a long time, I had been wanting to reinforce it, but how? I decided to make my first attempt with our prisoners. I ordered 370 of the Bolshevists to line up. They were all officers and non-commissioned officers, and I had them shot on the spot. Then I told the rest that they too deserved death, but that I had let those who had misled them take the responsibility for their treason because I wanted to give them a chance to atone for their crime and prove their loyalty to their country. Weapons were distributed to them immediately, and 2 weeks later, they went into the fighting line and behaved with great courage. Later, this battalion became one of the best in the whole army and covered itself with glory. We continued to advance on Stavropol, fighting almost every day. Things grew warm not far from the little railway station of Pelagiata, some kilometers from the town. The enemy was firmly entrenched, having beaten back our infantry division. I wheeled my forces during the night, and at dawn fell upon the Reds from the cover of a wood. They broke and took to their heels in a panic, pursued by my regiments. Followed by several squadrons, I reached the suburbs of the town, where the fighting had already begun. The Reds had entrenched themselves in a convent, which we outflanked. Some Cossacks and horses were killed. I deployed my squadrons, drew my sword, and putting myself at their head, led the charge. The streets in the cloister were cleared of Reds, and we entered the suburbs, cutting down anyone who tried to stop us. Our horses were tied up in the precincts of the convent. The wounded came pouring in. The cloister door opened, and a priest came out, followed by nuns. Bullets were still raining down, crashing against the walls, but the priest and nuns did not seem to notice them. They tended the wounded and gave them food and drink, whilst the priest sprinkled the Cossacks with holy water. It was a beautiful and touching sight. In the cloisters, we discovered 2 officers who had succeeded in escaping from the town. The Father Superior had disguised them as nuns, and when the Reds had come to the convent, they had not even suspected their identity. On November 2nd, I entered Stavropol to the sound of bugles, followed by my escort. There was still skirmishing going on in some directions. The streets were littered with corpses, dead horses, and overturned wagons. As they heard the sound of the bugles, the citizens came out of doors weeping, clapping their hands, cheering, and bringing the Cossacks wine, cigarettes, and money. One old lady caught hold of my stirrup and tried to kiss my hand. The town had been through a terrible time. The Bolshevist authorities had fallen out amongst themselves and had shot the commander of their troops. Anarchy was at its height. One and all were free to rob, pillage, and shoot. In the courtyard of the house where I was to lodge lay dozens of corpses, their fingers cut off and their eyes gouged out. We took an immense amount of booty, but I forbade anyone to touch it until the civil authorities arrived. The citizens were forced to give up their weapons. But it was difficult to reestablish even a semblance of order, for passion and hatred was still running wild. On the following day, the Circassians broke into a hospital where several hundred of the enemy's wounded were lying, and massacred 70. I sent my orderly officer to arrest the culprits. According to the doctors, one of them was an officer, but unfortunately, we did not succeed in arresting him. A short time after we had taken the town, an officer who had been commander of the governor's guard before the arrival of the Reds had put himself under my orders. I had appointed him governor of the prison to which the Bolshevists had been sent. A few hours later, I was informed that he had shot them. I ordered his arrest, but a score or so of men had already been executed. When the governor arrived, I handed him over, but I do not know what happened to him. 2 in the Nogai steppes. The Reds were retreating northwards. We followed hard on their heels. One night, after a fairly lively engagement in which we had taken thousands of prisoners and all the rolling stock held by an enemy division, I received a dispatch ordering me to go and meet General Denikin, who had just arrived at Erovzvianaya station. I rode over there on horseback. The moonlight was trickling through a thick mist. Villages, trees, and fields had all taken on the livid hue of corpses, which gave them a weird, dismal appearance. The road was not only strewn with the dead bodies of men and horses, but was also churned up by the rain. As I was splashing through a large pool, my horse reared. A grinning corpse was staring at me, its head alone visible, for the water hid its body. A few paces farther on, an arm was stretched out towards me. My horse trembled, snorted with fear, and shied from side to side. The general thanked me for my division's success and told me that I had been appointed to the command of a cavalry corps consisting of my division and Colonel Ulagay's 2nd Division. The Reds were retreating, but nevertheless they contested every inch with stubborn tenacity. My men were a good way ahead of the other troops. One night the Reds succeeded in wheeling round on us, and one of their platoons entered the village where we were sleeping. I had only 30 Cossacks with me, the rest having been left behind to cover the train, and 30 more men in my escort. There was not the smallest chance of putting up a resistance. If the Reds had acted more boldly, they could have taken us all. But they hesitated, confining themselves to shooting down on us, and could not make up their minds to attack. Our transport was ready for instant departure. We dressed hastily, the horses were saddled, and we left the village at full speed. Unfortunately, the equipment belonging to 2 regiments and also my wife's ambulance cars fell into the hands of the enemy. The doctor managed to escape, but one of the sisters was taken prisoner. Providence was watching over my wife. The evening before, she had left the captured ambulance in order to convey the wounded from the town. Meanwhile, the enemy was attacking Colonel Ulagay's units. We held our position throughout the day, but by evening we had run out of ammunition and had to retreat. I took the necessary measures and then rode off with my orderly officer, Captain Prince Obolensky, my old comrade in the Horse Guards, to rejoin Colonel Ulagay. During the night, we reached a village which seemed to be empty, but passing through it at a brisk trot we heard sounds of firing in one of the streets. The Reds hidden in the village were opening fire near the bridge. When we reached the spot, we had the devil of a time. I was riding a gray horse, an excellent target, and the bullets simply rained down. The prince edged his horse close up to mine, seeking to cover me with his own body. "Get back at once," I shouted. "I command you to go back," but I shouted in vain. He continued to gallop by my side, boot to boot, and we got through safe and sound. At dawn, the enemy attacked us. We held out until the evening, but we used all our ammunition. I was brought some enemy dispatches, which had been found on one of the bodies. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the Reds were going to attack us all along the line. I decided to attack them first before they had time to concentrate. I collected from the men all the cartridges they had left and distributed them among 2 regiments, who then deployed in skirmishing order. The rest of the troops remained on our left flank, and at dawn, before the enemy had finished concentrating, we charged. We penetrated the enemy's front line, and the Reds broke, making off at top speed. Most of them were slain, and many were drowned in the river. I decided to profit from the advance my troops had made and lend a hand to General Kasanovich, who was operating on my right. We marched all through the night, and at dawn on November 22nd, I turned on the Reds and attacked them from the rear. The enemy scattered. We took 2,000 prisoners, 7 guns, 40 machine guns, and all their transport. That evening, we took up our position alongside the Kalius. On the morning of the 24th, the enemy resumed the offensive, for they had obtained reinforcements. They succeeded in driving back our right wing and came right up to the railroad. But at midday, our 1st Division made a counterattack. The enemy were worsted and fled. We took 1,500 more prisoners, a battery complete with horses and ammunition wagons, and 30 machine guns. As a result, my corps was mentioned in dispatches, and I was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general. I requested that Colonels Toporkev and Ulagay be promoted to the rank of general. Both were excellent officers. Toporkev, a simple Cossack, had begun his career as a private. Endowed with an innate flair for military matters, uncommon courage, elasticity, and trustworthy steadiness, he lived the same life as his men, slept in the same room, and ate at their mess. His every order had to be obeyed, and always was, cost what it might. But sometimes he expected too much, and sacrificed too many men to achieve his ends. Colonel Ulagay had a much more complex nature, vigorous and ambitious to a fault, but honest and noble-hearted, a man of exemplary courage and great military talents. He had a high reputation amongst his officers and Cossacks. He understood the art of getting out of difficult situations and knew how to take advantage of them. He could also take the initiative when necessary. Though he was a cavalry officer of great merit, he nevertheless had his faults. His was an unbalanced nature, and he was extremely touchy. His mood would change easily from enthusiasm to apathy. When he was beginning a task, he seemed to look for obstacles which would hinder its completion, but once he had made up his mind, he would carry out his decision brilliantly. In the course of the last few months, my command had received considerable reinforcements. In spite of heavy losses, its strength was almost normal. We were well supplied with artillery, technical equipment, telephones, telegraphs, and so on, which we had taken from the enemy. When the Reds had succeeded in making themselves masters of the Kuban district, they had had recourse to conscription there. Now these forced recruits were deserting en masse and coming over to us to defend their homes. They were good fighters, but once their own village was cleared of Reds, many of them left the ranks to cultivate their land once more. It was unlikely that the enemy would be able to continue the offensive for some time, for they had been completely demoralized by these last defeats. Nor were we in a position to continue our advance until we had reorganized. I took advantage of this respite to ask the Commander-in-Chief for leave to go to Supreme Headquarters and confer with the General Staff on questions of re-equipment, future action, etc., which had been left undecided. Having got General Denikin's authorization, I delegated the command to Ulagai, who had already been made a general, and set off with my wife, who had to attend to the needs of her ambulance at Ekaterinodar, where Supreme Headquarters were situated. General Denikin could not have received me more warmly. He said the most flattering things and acquiesced in all my demands, telling me to settle the details with General Romanovsky, his chief of staff. He also was very polite, but persistently refused to say yes or no. Neither refusing nor promising anything, his colleagues followed his example. Headquarters was snowed under with work. There was a deluge of waste paper. Forgetting or holding over the execution of less urgent measures, Supreme Headquarters was busy with questions which, though perhaps essential, were out of date so far as the present situation was concerned. They were revising and elaborating regulations and organizing committees of study for the great military formations. I was invited to sit on one of these committees, which dealt with questions concerning the cavalry. In my opinion, a strong cavalry force is even more necessary in a civil war than at any other time. The cavalry of the volunteer army consisted solely of Cossacks who, once their native village was won back, would fight far less wholeheartedly. It was absolutely necessary to recreate the old regular cavalry, which was, if I may say so, the finest in the world. We had the necessary cadres at hand, and also hundreds of old cavalry officers who were actually serving as privates in the infantry. But since the commander-in-chief and all his advisors were infantry officers, they were indifferent, not to say hostile, to the idea of organizing regular cavalry units. I drew up a memorandum in which I dealt with the question thoroughly and submitted it to the committee, which accepted it unanimously. But still, General Romanovsky would say neither yes nor no. I reached Ekaterinodar on the eve of the election of the Ataman by the District Rada, 2. The Right's candidate was Filimonov, the Ataman already in office, the Left's, one bitch, president of the Rada. Party conflict was at its height, but the Cossack units and most of the population were indifferent to it. Political strife directly in the rear of an army in wartime, especially when it was war to the death, could not be anything but injurious. In my opinion, it was most urgent that the commander-in-chief should do something to check it. A very little firmness would be enough. Too much abstinence from action would seem to indicate weakness. I broached the subject to General Denikin, but he turned a deaf ear. General Pokrovsky and Colonel Chkoro, who thoroughly understood the Cossacks, also spoke to him, but General Denikin had his own opinion. Colonel Filimonov was re-elected. He was ingenious and cautious, but lacking in resolution and incapable of coping with the circumstances, as later events showed. The campaign which Generals Alexeyev and Kornilov had undertaken grew in extent and gained stability. The Allies seemed to understand it. Their representatives appeared in Ekaterinodar, the English General Poole and the French Captain Fouquet. They had come to inspect the troops and see what they lacked. On November 11th, the armistice was signed between the Allies and Germany. The German army, which was occupying Russia, collapsed and fled hurriedly, selling its arms and ammunition, for it also was infected with the Bolshevist poison. In the Ukraine, things fell out as we had foreseen. The Hetman Skoropadsky had been put in power by the Germans and had maintained himself solely by their support. Now he decamped and took refuge in Germany. One of our best generals, Count Keller, was assassinated at Kiev III. The officers who had managed to escape went to Caucasia and the Don to continue the struggle. General Krasnov was there. Having fooled the Germans and wormed all he could out of them, he was now treating directly with the Allies. He and Denikin had not yet managed to come to an agreement, and each was negotiating separately. Denikin's headquarters were furious. They were saying that Krasnov would have to submit to Denikin. At Krasnov's headquarters, they were probably saying the same things about General Denikin. The fight against Bolshevism flared up in other parts of Russia. Admiral Kolchak's army was fighting in Siberia, General Miller's in the north. General Yudnich was trying to form one on the Baltic. It seemed as though the dawn of the resurrection was at hand. I realized that I was not doing any good at headquarters and returned to my command. By mid-December, the enemy had concentrated fresh troops. They took the initiative, attacked General Kasanovich's army corps, and forced it to retreat to Kalus. I obtained permission from headquarters to go to his relief. General Toporkov, with his 6 regiments, was to deflect the enemy and attack them. On the 20th, I heard that the commander-in-chief had left headquarters with the Allied missions to go to the front. The same day, Denikin telephoned me. He told me that Kasanovich had informed him that in view of the critical situation in which his column, which was on the march, found itself, he could not possibly concentrate his troops for Allied inspection. The general said to me, "Can I bring them along to you?" "With pleasure, Your Excellency," I replied. "What can you show them?" he asked. "I can only show them," I said, "how we pound the Reds. Do try and arrive tonight, so as to be able to march with the troops." I spent the night making the necessary arrangements and drawing up a detailed report of the situation and of the orders which had been given to the troops, with explanatory diagrams. I had the whole thing translated into English and French, then sent a picket of honor to meet the commander-in-chief. When I was told that the train was coming into the station, I too went along. The day was still young. It was raining, there was a watery sun, and puddles covered the ground. We moved at a walking pace, chilly in the mist. As far as the eye could see, stretched the bare, black, unfriendly steppe. All along the road, wagons stuck fast in the mud showed that we had had to abandon our transport. Many were dumped there, all without horses, for General Toporkov had taken them to supplement those drawing the artillery carts, which could not go on because of the mud. The mud was certainly terrible. The plastoones had difficulty in following the horses. As early as 4 o'clock that same afternoon, the column with which we were marching managed to turn the enemy's flank and open fire. We had eaten nothing for 12 hours and had been in the saddle most of the time. The commander-in-chief, his staff, and the foreign agents were unused to the fatigue of war and were feeling quite weak. I found a good observation post and suggested to the commander-in-chief that they should remain there, though I asked permission to go to my troops. I left my escort and my chief of staff with the general. My chief of staff was under orders to wait for half a battery and the plastoones to take command of them and to turn the enemy out of a certain village. Our column, en route for the valley, filed past the commander-in-chief, who shouted a few words of encouragement to them as they passed. Our regiments deployed in battle order under enemy fire and climbed the right bank of the river. Rather a long way to their right, firing could be heard. On our left, our 2nd Division could be seen approaching. A regiment commanded by a young man who had only the evening before been made a colonel was climbing the hill. I shouted to him, "Remember that you earned the rank of colonel." He immediately gave the word for the charge, and off they dashed at full speed. The firing was terrible. The horses constantly slipped and fell on the churned-up ground, but nothing could stop the gallant fellows. They continued to pursue the enemy and took a village by storm, hunting cavalry, infantry, vehicles, and ambulance cars into it. The 2nd Brigade, coming up at a brisk trot, cut them off from the road. Night drew on. Reports came in from all sides. The Reds were routed all along the front. We had taken more than 1,000 prisoners, 12 guns and 65 machine guns, and an immense amount of booty. The position which General Kasanovich had abandoned had been won back. I returned to the railway station to which General Denikin and the Allies had already gone. The journey seemed interminable. Out horses were at the end of their tether. I found General Denikin and the Allied mission having supper. They gave me a great welcome as I came in, for they already knew the result of the day's work. As soon as my guest's train had gone, I went to bed. I had had no sleep for 40 hours and had ridden more than 100 kilometers in the last 24 hours. By the end of December, the enemy's army was utterly destroyed and its remnants scattered over the steppe. On December 26th, a convention was signed between General Denikin and the head of the Don Cossacks government. The Don kept its autonomy, but gave up the supreme command of its army to General Denikin, who became not only commander-in-chief of the volunteer army, but also commander-in-chief of the armed forces of South Russia. The next day, a telegram from General Denikin informed me that I had been appointed commander-in-chief of the volunteer army, whilst General Pokrovsky was to take over the command of my cavalry division. The volunteer army was to continue the pursuit of the routed army, seize the town of Sviator Crest, the Reds' principal base, and then attack the 11th Red Army in the rear, whilst it was still covering the group of spas in Caucasia. After this, it was to join our cavalry, which was advancing by way of the railway, and finish off the enemy. After a few days of desperate fighting, the enemy army was routed, and we occupied the spas. 3. The liberation of Terek. As I had no one in mind for my chief of staff, the commander-in-chief suggested my having General Yusefovich. I did not know him personally, but only by reputation, and a very good reputation it was. I accepted the suggestion, and have never regretted so doing. I could not have had a better man. On January 8th, I heard that the commander-in-chief was arriving the next day at the spas, where I wanted to establish my headquarters. For the last few days, I had been feeling ill and had not left my railway carriage. As I was attempting to do so, in order to go and call on the general, one of his messengers came to tell me that he was coming to see me. He told me that the troops operating in the coal mining district of Donetsk and in the Crimea were to be amalgamated and called the Volunteer Army. Those that I commanded were to take the name of the Caucasian Army. I refused to give up the title hallowed by the names of Generals Kornilov and Alexeyev, and as a concession, my army was called the Volunteer Caucasian Army. I entered upon my duties on January 10th and issued a general order to my troops. In the early days of the revolution, a large number of people, most of them society folk, had left the capital cities and taken refuge at the spas. As soon as the Reds got to Caucasia, the refugees were persecuted in every conceivable way, but when it was known that the Whites were coming, the real terror began, and got worse daily. The Bolshevists shot hundreds of men, including General Ruski, the former commander-in-chief of the armies on the northern front, and Radko Dmitriev, the hero of Galicia. Everyone who had escaped death had lost a brother, son, or father, and most of them all their worldly possessions too. Great numbers of these poor devils were terrified that the Reds would return and fled to the rear of our army, crowding out the railway stations and the trains. The spas were still overrun by Bolshevists who had not been able to escape in time and were now trying to break through our lines, thinking that they would be safer there than on the scene of their crimes. Typhus was raging, there was practically no medical service and a complete lack of drugs. The epidemic spread terribly. For lack of hospitals, the sufferers were packed together in private houses, stations, and railway carriages. Having no one to nurse them, the poor wretches dragged themselves out into the streets to look for food and died there. We did everything in our power to bring a little order into this confusion, ordered the disinfecting of the stations and vehicles, and turned shops and cinemas into new hospitals. General Pokrovsky, who was to take over the command of my corps, came and presented himself to me. He knew I was prejudiced against him, but showed great tact and dignity in his awkward position, and did not attempt to be pleasant to me at all costs. In short, he behaved like a sensible man. The commander-in-chief called a council of war consisting of his adjutant for civil affairs, General Dragomnov, Romanovsky, his chief of staff, General Lyakov, General Yusefovich, my chief of staff, and myself. He outlined his plan of campaign. All the troops which could be spared after northern Caucasia had been freed were to be concentrated in the Donetsk coalfield, which was being occupied by General Mamaevsky. Only those which were really needed to cover the Manich line were to be left behind. The rest were to operate near Kharkov. However, I proposed that the available troops should not be moved towards the Donetsk coalfield area, but into the Manich Lake district, there to undertake a joint operation with Admiral Kolchak's army, which was coming up from the Volga. General Romanovsky objected that the coalfield area was indispensable to us, and that since Moscow was our ultimate goal, the shortest way to get there was by way of Kharkov. General Yusefovich seconded my scheme, but it was of no avail. General Denikin stuck to his point of view. I saw the general several times daily. Together we went for a day's trip to the Kislovodsky baths, and as we talked of this and that, I got to know him. I have already said Denikin was one of the best generals in the old Russian army, a man of high military rank who had won his excellent reputation during the World War. He distinguished himself many times at the head of his Iron Division. Later, as chief of the Supreme General Staff at the very beginning of the revolution, he had made a courageous attempt to check the dissolution by grouping all the officers round the Supreme Command. Everyone knows his brilliant closing speech at the Officers' Congress at Mogilev. He was an exceptionally fine speaker, but could only be appreciated by an intelligent audience. He did not know how to grip the troops, and his personal appearance was no help to him. He had not a commanding presence. In fact, there was nothing of the great chief about him. He lacked that indefinable something which fires the imagination and stirs the heart. He came from a lower middle-class family, had spent his childhood in the country, and most of his time since in little garrison towns. He owed his success in his career to stubborn, hard work. He had developed what he believed to be infallible powers of judgment and would credit no one's opinion but his own. Yet he was often less clear-sighted than men who were otherwise his inferiors. He was the son of a minor officer of the line, and he had made up his mind to back the humbler classes against the aristocrats, the courtiers, and officers of the guard. He was morbidly sensitive and took meticulous care to safeguard his dignity against slights which were sometimes purely imaginary. Destiny had laid upon his shoulders the burden of a gigantic task in a sphere quite foreign to him, and had plunged him into a whirlpool of passions and political intrigue. He felt lost, he said, at this unsuitable work, was afraid of making mistakes, trusted nobody, and yet failed to find sufficient strength in himself to enable him to navigate the ship of state with a firm hand over the stormy waters. The struggle went on. The enemy made vain efforts to stop our advances and managed to avoid a decisive defeat. General Pokrovsky was still pursuing them. At Mozdok, Makinskaya, and Kalmovskaya, the remnants of the enemy's army, which had formerly numbered 150,000 men, were absolutely destroyed. A few cavalry troops were all that managed to escape to the steppes of Astrakhan, but all that was left of the infantry and artillery fell into our hands. The road along which the Reds had retreated was choked with cars, guns, wagons, dead, and wounded. Our cavalry took 31,000 prisoners, 8 armored cars, 200 cannon, and 300 machine guns. Our advance guard was at Kizlar, our outposts on the shores of the Caspian. In 12 days, our cavalry had covered a distance of 350 kilometers. Once Pokrovsky was in occupation of Kizlar, I went off to thank the troops. Halfway there, finding that the railway lines had been destroyed, I made the rest of the journey by car. Traces of the disorderly retreat of the Red Army were to be seen everywhere. The highway was covered with corpses, derelict carts, and dead horses. All the houses and sheds were full of wounded. At Mozdok, 65 kilometers farther on, there were not only guns, carts, ambulances, and vast numbers of corpses, but also convoys of prisoners, marching by one after the other in an uninterrupted stream. Ragged, starving, with bare, bleeding feet, thousands of these poor creatures dragged themselves along with an escort of only a few Cossacks. 2 Cossacks were enough to guard several thousand prisoners, ill or wounded, as most of them were. There were many stragglers. They marched along, stumbling and falling, getting onto their feet again with the greatest difficulty and attempting to go on, then sinking down, never to get up again. I went into a signalman's hut at an abandoned railway station. 8 men were lying there, pressed close against one another. I asked one of them where the station master was. He did not answer. I questioned one of the others. No reply. I stooped down to them. They were all dead except one who was in the last throes. He was clasping a dying dog to his chest, trying to get some warmth from it. The stations and sidings were crammed with abandoned trains, the engines burnt out, the carriage doors stoved in. The people of the neighborhood were looting them. All mixed up with guns, carpets, and 101 lovely things were the dead and wounded. In one of the trains, I saw a dying man with his head pillowed on his comrade's dead body. In one station, I was shown an ambulance train. There were 44 carriages full of dead bodies, and not one live man amongst them. One carriage was devoted to Sisters of Charity and doctors, dead too, of course. General Pokrovsky had sent a score or two of men to clear the stations of the dead and wounded. They were shoveling them on to the handcarts as though they were coals and throwing them into sandpits. From Kargalmskaya station to Kislar, a distance of 25 kilometers, the line was obstructed by the debris of rolling stock and piles of merchandise. It must have been worth millions. There was no one to guard all this wealth, and everyone was taking what he wanted. Some trucks full of ammunition had just been overturned. The wreck was still smoldering, and masses of corpses, including those of women and children, were lying on the ground. The Terek had been freed and was coming to life again. In the streets through which we passed, many houses had been destroyed, but the streets were crowded. The people laughed and sang and cheered us. The Cossacks were galloping about. The women in their beautiful peasant dresses were taking their children for walks. My chauffeur pulled up to ask the way. A crowd of children collected to take a look at us at close quarters. About a dozen little urchins, the eldest of whom could not have been more than 14 or 15, were shouldering rifles twice as big as themselves. "Hello, children. What are you doing with those things?" I called. "Hunting the Reds," was the reply. "They're hiding down in the reeds by the river." "I've killed 7 of them today," said a 12-year-old in a big fur cap. Never before during our civil war had the full horror of this fratricidal struggle struck me so clearly. The town of Groznoy, center of the petrol wells, had been won back, so had the bigger town of Vladikavkaz. After some bloody encounters, the last remnants of the Reds who had taken refuge in the mountains had been killed off or taken prisoners. One of our divisions by itself had taken more than 10,000. Northern Caucasia was free. General Denikin's armies now had a base, an extraordinarily rich piece of territory, a big reserve force, and everything that was necessary for the troops. I had only just gone back to the spas when I was taken ill. I forced myself to get about as usual and do my work, but in the end I had to take to my bed. Typhus set in, and complications developed, owing to an old wound. I received first-class attention from 2 famous doctors, both professors from Petersburg, who were also refugees in Caucasia, but to no avail. The doctors declared that I could not pull through. My wife arrived, but I did not recognize her. The doctors told her that she must be prepared for the worst. They told General Yusefovich that I could not live through the night. The last sacrament was administered to me. Then at 7 o'clock in the morning came the crisis, and I turned the corner. My convalescence was a slow business. I was not allowed to get up until the middle of March. The commander-in-chief wrote me a very kind letter. I was so weak that it took me hours to write him a reply. I cannot sufficiently praise the kindness of my friends, and of perfect strangers. General Denikin knew that I was in financial difficulties and charged up the expenses of my illness to the government. The doctors refused to take their fees, and strangers sent me wine, fruit, and other things. Whilst I was ill, my army was transferred to the coalfield area in Donetsk. General Ulagai and his cavalry corps were the only ones left behind to cover the Sviator Crest district. A few regiments under General Chatilov were still at Dagestan, clearing the villages of Reds. My headquarters had been transferred to Rostov-on-the-Don, where General Yusefovich was taking my place during my absence. I still had my special escort and some of my staff officers with me. The doctors forbade me to do any work, so my wife and I went to Sochi, a spa and seaside town on the Black Sea. We took my escort with us, and also one or two orderly officers. A delightful villa had been put at our disposal, and the country round about was beautiful. I kept in touch with my headquarters by telegraph. Yusefovich sent me the report which he had presented to the commander-in-chief, in which he had again stressed the absolute necessity of joining up with Admiral Kolchak's army. I did not stay in the country very long. The news was bad. The Reds had driven back General Borovsky's troops and advanced into the Crimea. Relations between our commander-in-chief and the government of Georgia had grown very bitter, and a complete rupture seemed likely. Hostilities were expected to begin on the frontier near Sochi in a day or two. In the neighboring mountains, bands of deserters from the Red and White armies, known as Greens, were organizing themselves at the instigation of the Georgians. As the Greens became aggressive, the commander of the little garrison in Sochi asked me to let my escort reconnoiter on the outskirts of the town. I told one of the officers to take some men and do as requested. 12 kilometers from the town, the Greens fell upon them, killing a Cossack and 2 horses. The commander of the garrison sent out a detachment to drive the Greens back. The officer and a number of men were killed. Headquarters got to hear of this, sent reinforcements for the garrison, and ordered me to leave the town immediately. As the railway was already threatened, a torpedo boat was sent to fetch me. Many of my officers had their wives and children with them, and my escort was mounted. It was impossible to get everybody, horses and all, on board a small torpedo boat, and I hated the thought of leaving anyone behind, so I decided to travel by train, come what might. I had machine guns put on the engine, and when night had fallen, we started off. The Greens sent some bullets after us, but they had not destroyed the permanent way, and we arrived safely. On the way, I had the train stopped on the Kuban frontier and went to thank some towns and villages who had elected me an honorary Cossack. Life had resumed its normal course everywhere. There had been a good harvest, and the country was getting rich again. The Cossacks gave me a cordial welcome and talked to me as if I had been one of themselves. The Cossack proletariat is much more civilized than the Russian peasantry, always having had self-government of a kind. They one and all complained of our government, meaning the Kuban government. They thought that the Rada talked too much and quarreled too often, formulating policies, but not really considering the true needs of the country. A little while before Easter, I arrived at Ekaterinodar, where the doctors sent me to bed again. But before I obeyed them, I forced myself to go and see the commander-in-chief, who also prescribed a complete rest for me until I was quite well again. Headquarters took a rosier view of things than ever, in spite of the Red invasion of the Crimea, the complications with Georgia, and the bitter and fruitless struggles in the coal fields. The question of military operations seemed to have been relegated to a secondary place. Important political matters had come to the fore. The help which France and England had promised had begun to materialize. Boats laden with war materials and drugs, things of which the army was in great need, had arrived at Novorossiysk. They promised us tanks and aeroplanes. Northern Caucasia was unanimous in recognizing General Denikin as commander-in-chief. In his secret conflict with the Ataman of the Don, it was Denikin who came off best. Krasnov fell, and a new Ataman, Bogorevsky, came into power. He was a pusillanimous man, and headquarters could do as they liked with him. In the Terek and the Kuban, Denikin's power was almost absolute, though it is true that his relations with the government of Ekaterinodar, with Ataman as well as Rada, were rather strained, since they disagreed on most questions. Headquarters showed the rankest intolerance towards the Cossacks and all others who did not blindly endorse their point of view. Denikin's motto, "Russia, one and indivisible," a vague and obscure phrase on the whole, was to be everyone's watchword. Those who held any other opinion, or were reputed to do so, were stigmatized as separatists. Anyone was called a separatist who had fought the Reds under the Ukrainian flag, or who had taken service with the hetman. This included a very large number of officers who were now serving in the volunteer army. These officers did not give a thought for headquarters' high politics, but were ready to fight the Bolshevists, whatever their leader's motto might be. But headquarters regarded them almost as traitors. Before they were admitted to the service, they had to pass through a purgatory called the Committee of Rehabilitation, an unjust, severe, and unintelligent proceeding. Admiral Kolchak's army was coming up the Volga. The enemy had concentrated their forces on the eastern front and tried in vain to stop it. Operations had been impossible on this front for some time, owing to the snow. In the south, we had not been very successful during the last 4 months, though we were still occupying the south bank of the Manich. In the Donetsk coalfield area, we had been obliged to withdraw our left wing to Mariupol. Our Crimean troops had been driven back towards the Isthmus of Kerch. The commander-in-chief and his general staff were not satisfied with General Yusefovich and hoped that once I took up the reins again, our luck would turn. I still disapproved of their plan of campaign. The crying need to join forces with Kolchak's army simply stared us in the face. As all my attempts to reopen the subject were fruitless, I sent the commander-in-chief a report in which I detailed the situation from my point of view. In my opinion, since the enemy's forces were infinitely superior to our own, we ought not to operate simultaneously in several directions, but should take decisive action against their weakest spot. Actually, this spot could only be Tsaritsyn on the Volga. From there, we could effect a junction with Kolchak's army. I decided that we would have to give up our operations in the coalfields. If we shortened our front on the right bank of the Don by about 150 kilometers and took the initiative in the direction I had indicated, it would be all that we could manage. Otherwise, the initiative would fall to the enemy, and they would be threatening our base. My prophecies soon came true. On April 12th, I learnt from headquarters that the enemy had stormed Manich and moved up to the line of the Vladikavkaz-Rostov Railway. Our units retreated, scarcely putting up any resistance. On the 13th, I was awakened during the night. The chief of headquarters' general staff and the quartermaster general were there and wanted to see me. Romanovsky told me that there was disastrous news from the front. We had got to do something desperate. He asked me to take command of all the troops we could possibly muster and send to Manich. As Yusefovich was still at Rostov, deputizing for me, I would have to leave him my general staff, but I could form another. It was impossible to do anything with the forces they proposed to give me, and I could not form an efficient general staff from men selected anyhow from all over the place. I told him that under such conditions I must refuse the command, and I pointed out to him where the troops necessary to stop the Red advance were to be found. But he did not agree with me. He thought that if the troops were moved from one place to another, we should be risking a panic at Rostov. I told him that there was no fear of this because, in the circumstances, I would leave for the town immediately. Ill as I was, my headquarters was there already, and I would resume my command straight away. "Your refusal," said Romanovsky, "will force the commander-in-chief himself to take the Manich command which he offered to you." I replied that this would be all to the good. The commander-in-chief could transfer troops from wherever he thought proper, whereas I would have had to make do with whatever troops had been given to me. Moreover, circumstances would compel him to use some of those I had. Romanovsky, Plushchevsky-Plushchik, the quartermaster general, and I were not on very good terms when we parted. The next day, the commander-in-chief asked me if I had not changed my mind. I answered that, with the troops that his chief of staff was willing to allow me, it was impossible to carry out his plan, and I asked his permission to return to my headquarters and resume my command. That evening, I left for Rostov.